I stood behind that podium, in front of millions of people, looked down at my notes, and could not say a single word. Not because I forgot what I had prepared, not because the lights were too bright or the room was too loud, but because I no longer believed any of it. And somewhere between the camera flashing to life and the silence stretching out across that studio, everything I had spent 20 years building began to fall apart in real time. What do you do when the book you devoted your entire career to destroying is the very one that finds you first? If you want to know what happened the night I walked away from that stage, make sure you subscribe, because this is the story I have never fully told anyone until right now. My name is Idris Al-Hakim, and before I take you to that broadcast, I need to take you somewhere else first. Somewhere smaller, somewhere that smelled like old paper and cardamom and engine exhaust drifting in from the street outside. I was 11 years old. My uncle Samir ran a second-hand bookshop on a narrow side street in the city where I grew up. The shop was barely wide enough for two people to pass each other between the shelves, and the shelves themselves were stacked so high that he kept a wooden step stool near the back that he moved around like it was furniture. The place smelled the way I imagined the inside of someone's memory smells, dusty and warm, and a little bit like somewhere you have been before, even when you haven't. Uncle Samir was not a religious scholar. He was not a teacher in any official sense. He was a man who had read everything and forgotten nothing, and spent his days arguing cheerfully with customers who made the mistake of bringing half-formed opinions into his shop. One Tuesday afternoon, he handed me a small pamphlet across the counter. It was printed on cheap paper, the kind that yellows fast. A Christian evangelism tract, the kind someone leaves on a park bench or slips under a windshield wiper. He said, "Read this and tell me what's wrong with it. Not what you believe about it. Not whether it offends you. What is wrong with it?" I took it to the back of the shop and read it 3 times. Then I came back out and said, "It doesn't answer its own questions. It raises things and then moves on before it deals with them." Uncle Samir set down his tea, looked at me for a long moment, and said, "You are going to be trouble." He said it like a compliment. That afternoon planted something in me that grew in a direction I did not fully understand for a long time. Uncle Samir was not teaching me to argue. He was teaching me to think. He was teaching me the difference between a conviction and an assumption, between a position and a performance. He had this way of sitting with an idea the way other people sit with coffee, patient and warm, not trying to rush it into something it wasn't. He died when I was 19, quietly, in a hospital room, with a philosophy text sitting face down on his chest, like he had dozed off mid-sentence. I sat with him in that room for a long time after. I spent the next 25 years, or what I told myself were the next 25 years, trying to honor what he gave me. What I actually spent those years doing is something I understand differently now, but I am getting ahead of myself. By my mid-30s, I had written 4 books. 3 of them were works of Islamic apologetics, structured arguments defending the historical reliability of Islamic scripture while systematically challenging the same reliability in Christian texts. The 4th was a collection of transcribed lectures that sold more copies than the other 3 combined, which told me something about what people wanted, though I was slow to think too carefully about what that something was. I had a television program, twice a week, national broadcast, a format that mixed lecture and conversation with occasional guests. I had a social media following that had grown large enough that when I posted something on a Tuesday, it was being quoted back at me by Friday. I had been invited to universities, government events, interfaith conferences. My name appeared on panels next to men with longer academic titles than mine, and I usually left those panels feeling I had held my own. But my reputation, the thing that drove the book sales and the television contracts and the speaking invitations, rested most of all on a single claim. The gospel that Christians use today cannot be the original, uncorrupted word of God. I had made this argument in every format that existed. In books, in lectures, in live debates, in television interviews conducted by hosts who occasionally pushed back and more often did not. I had structured it historically, pointing to manuscript transmission, to textual variance, to the long gap between the events described and the documents describing them. I had presented it with sources, with footnotes, with the specific texture of someone who had done the work and arrived at a settled conclusion. Thousands of students had walked out of my seminars holding that conclusion like something they had earned. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to look back and say I was simply dishonest. But I don't think that's quite right. I think I believed what I was saying, or I believed it, which is a different thing, and a more dangerous one. I had surrounded myself so completely with scholarship that confirmed my existing position that the position had stopped feeling like a position at all. It felt like ground, the kind of ground you stop questioning because you've been standing on it long enough that it seems to have always been there. The call from the television network came on a Tuesday morning in October. I was at my desk, second cup of tea, reviewing notes for an upcoming seminar. The head of programming for one of the largest religious broadcast networks in the country introduced himself and then described an idea he said had been building for 2 years. A 3-hour live special, prime time, national audience, Sheikh Idris al-Hakim, presenting what he called, and I remember the exact phrase because he used it 3 times in 5 minutes, the definitive historical case against the authenticity of the gospel. I told him I would think about it. I called him back in 40 minutes and said yes. What I felt in that moment was not arrogance, or not only arrogance. It was more like recognition, like a door you've been walking toward, without knowing it, has finally come into view. I had spent 20 years building exactly this argument, refining it, testing it in smaller venues, sharpening it against every counter-argument I had encountered. If there was ever a moment for it, if there was ever a stage large enough to hold it, this was the one. The network moved fast. Within 2 weeks, billboards were going up in 6 cities. My face on the side of a building. A countdown clock appeared on their website. Social media lit up with shares and tags and previews. Christian groups expressed concern. Muslim communities shared the announcement with open excitement. News outlets picked up the story and ran pieces framing it as the largest religious confrontation ever attempted on live television. Fellow scholars started calling me. Some wanted previews. Some wanted to be consulted. Some just wanted to congratulate me before it happened, which I found slightly strange, but didn't say so. One older scholar I had great respect for left a voice message that said simply, "Brother Idris, this is the moment. Don't waste it." I had no intention of wasting it. About 3 weeks after the announcement, I was in my study doing what I always did before a major presentation, reviewing and refining the arguments I had already made many times, the manuscript transmission evidence, the textual variance, the historical gap between the events and the documents, the counsel arguments, the familiar architecture of a case I had built brick by brick over 2 decades. And then something stopped me. It was a thought so simple it almost embarrassed me. I had never read the thing. Not all the way through. Not genuinely, cover to cover, the way I read the texts I took seriously. I had read selections, certainly. I had read verses pulled for comparison with other texts. I had read what Christian scholars wrote about the gospel and what Muslim scholars wrote about those Christian scholars, and what other scholars wrote in response to that. I had read commentaries and counter-commentaries and histories of the documents themselves, but I had never sat down with Matthew chapter 1 verse 1 and read it the way my uncle had taught me to read, looking at what was actually there rather than looking for what I expected to find. And then I thought, practically, if I stand in front of cameras and argue against a text I have never fully read, any serious Christian scholar in the live response segments could expose that in 30 seconds. And the entire event would unravel. It was a strategic decision. That is what I told myself. I would read it so no one could accuse me of arguing against something I didn't know. I told my assistant I needed 2 weeks of intensive preparation time. I told the network the presentation was developing beautifully. I closed the door to my study, sat down at my desk, and opened the gospel. I started with Matthew. The first few chapters gave me exactly what I expected. Genealogy lists that I had noted in previous work as internally inconsistent, depending on which tradition you followed. The birth narrative, with its familiar details, material I knew from years of working around it. I moved through it the way I would move through a text I was professionally engaged with, efficiently, noting what I needed, setting aside what I didn't. Then, I kept reading. I don't know exactly when it changed. That's the honest answer. It wasn't a moment with a clear before and after. It was more like the transition between light and dark on a long evening, the kind where you look up and realize you can no longer see the same things you were looking at an hour ago, and you're not sure exactly when that happened. Somewhere in the middle of Matthew, I reached the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. I read it, moved on, found myself 3 paragraphs later, and came back. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. I sat with that one for a while, without fully understanding why. I had read ancient texts in multiple languages. I had spent years in scholarship that required sitting with difficult, dense, historically complex material. I understood rhetoric. I understood the craft of persuasion. I understood how language is shaped to produce specific emotional effects in specific audiences. These sentences did not read like that. They did not have the texture of a forger. A forger writes with anxiety underneath, with the specific urgency of someone who needs you to believe them. These sentences had no urgency. They read like someone who already knew what was true and simply stated it, the way you state the temperature of the room you're sitting in. I made a note in my research journal. Emotionally effective writing does not equal historical authenticity. I underlined it. I kept going. Mark's gospel is short and moves like something on fire. Events happen fast. There's almost no pause between miracles, almost no breathing room between encounters. I found myself reading faster without intending to, pulled along by the pace of it. Luke had a different quality, more careful, more structured, like someone who was determined that nothing important would be left out. John was unlike the others in a way that I couldn't quite categorize. More interior, more philosophical, but not in the way of something constructed to sound philosophical. In the way of someone who had been very close to something and was still turning it over decades later. I finished John at nearly midnight. I had been reading for 9 consecutive hours. My desk lamp had been the only light in the study for the last 3 of them. My wife had knocked twice, and I had told her I was fine. My dinner sat untouched on a tray outside the door. I looked at my research notebook. I had expected to have a collection of sharp, specific, ready-to-deploy arguments. What I had instead were questions, not the hostile, rhetorical questions I usually prepared for debates, the kind designed to appear unanswerable, genuine questions, the kind that arise when you've been holding a position so long that you've stopped testing it, and then something forces you to test it again. Questions about the arguments I had been making publicly for 20 years, specific ones. Whether the claims I had made about textual corruption were as definitive as I had presented them. Whether I had been showing audiences the strongest version of the opposing evidence before defeating it. Or whether I had been selecting easier versions. Whether the historical case I had built with such visible confidence was actually as settled as the confidence implied. I closed the notebook and went to bed. I lay awake until past 4 in the morning. The manuscript questions were troubling, but they were professional questions. What kept me awake was something else entirely, something I didn't have a research category for and couldn't footnote away. It was the voice. Not literally, but something about the consistent texture of the thing I had just read for 9 hours. A quality to it that I was having trouble putting inside the box marked sophisticated forgery, or even sincere but historically unreliable record. I had read a lot of sophisticated forgeries. I knew what they felt like. I knew the micro-expressions of a text that was trying to convince you of something it wasn't sure about. This didn't feel like that. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. I stared at the ceiling in the dark and thought about my uncle handing me a pamphlet across a counter and saying, "Tell me what's wrong with it." I thought about how I had spent 25 years developing the answer to that question. and I thought about whether the answer I had developed was actually the result of serious inquiry, or whether it was the result of serious-looking inquiry that had already decided where it was going before it started. I said nothing to my wife. I said nothing to my assistant. The next morning I woke up before 7, made tea in the kitchen, and went back to my study. I started pulling the actual primary historical sources, not summaries, not Islamic scholarly commentary on Christian scholarship. The original documents, early Christian writings from the 1st and 2nd centuries, letters, records of what those communities believed and practiced within living memory of the events, manuscript histories from secular scholars with no theological stake in the outcome. I worked through them methodically over the next several days, and what I found was not what I had been presenting on television for the better part of a decade. I want to be precise here, because I'm not a person who trades in vague spiritual impressions. I'm a scholar, or I was trained as one, and when I say the historical picture was different than I had presented, I mean specifically, the timeline of document composition was earlier than I had stated in lectures. The manuscript tradition, while complex, was more robust than I had characterized it to audiences. Many of the arguments I had made about Council of Nicaea, arguments I had delivered with complete conviction in packed lecture halls, were oversimplifications that would not survive contact with actual historians of the period, whether Christian, secular, or from any other tradition. I had been confident. Genuinely, subjectively confident. But the confidence had been built on a foundation of scholarly quotations that confirmed what I had already decided, rather than a foundation of first-hand examination of what the evidence actually showed. I sat at my desk on the 4th day of this research and did not move for a long time. My production team was calling my assistant daily. The network wanted updated presentation slides. Sponsors had increased their investment and wanted assurance the event was on track. Younger students who followed my work had been posting things online about how this broadcast would be remembered for generations. I thought about all of those people, not abstractly. I thought about their faces. The young men in my seminars who had scribbled notes as fast as they could, and then gone home and used my certainty as though it were a weapon they had earned the right to carry. I thought about how many conversations had been shaped by confidence I had handed out with the ease of someone who had checked, when in reality, I had never fully checked. I had sorted, I had selected, I had arranged, but I had not fully checked. That realization was the one that cracked me. It came down quietly, not dramatically, not with a crash, more like a long exhale after years of holding a breath I hadn't known I was holding. I was not ready to say I believed the gospel was true, but I was no longer able to say I believed it was a forgery. And those two things, which had always seemed to occupy opposite ends of a very long spectrum, suddenly felt much closer together than I had built my career on them being. The broadcast was 11 days away. I started avoiding the phone. My wife noticed. She is not a person who needs things spelled out for her, which has always been one of the things I am most grateful for about her, and occasionally, the thing that makes her hardest to be around when I am keeping something in. One evening she was sitting in the living room reading, and I walked in and stood near the window for a while without sitting down. She turned a page, let the silence run for a minute, then looked up. "Are you sleeping?" she asked. "Some," I said. "Is the presentation ready?" I looked at her. "It's coming along." She held my eyes for a moment, and then went back to her book. But I saw the small change in her expression that meant she had decided to let me have the version of events I was offering for now, and that we would return to the real one later. 3 days before the broadcast, I drove to the television studio for the scheduled full rehearsal. The space was something to see. High ceilings, professional lighting rigged across a full grid overhead, LED screens that would display my visual evidence across an expanse that made the whole thing feel like a courtroom crossed with a cathedral. The audience seating curved in a gentle arc around the stage. There were cameras on rails. There were monitors everywhere. My name was printed on small white cards attached to every console in the production booth. I walked to the podium. A technician clipped a microphone to my lapel. Someone in the booth gave a hand signal. The cameras came to life. I looked down at my opening statement. 12 sentences I had written and rewritten over 3 weeks. Sentences I had once believed were the 12 most precise and devastating sentences I had ever constructed. I read the first sentence. I read the second. I stopped. I stood at that podium for what the producer later told me was nearly 45 seconds of complete silence. I was not panicking. I was not having a breakdown. I was experiencing something much quieter and much more final than either of those things. I was simply understanding, with total clarity, that I could not say these sentences. Not because I had lost my nerve, not because the cameras intimidated me. I had been on camera most of my adult life, but because the sentences were not true, and I was not capable of standing in a room full of equipment designed to broadcast me to millions of people and saying things I did not believe. "Sheikh Idris, are you all right?" The producer's voice through the monitor speakers. "I need a moment," I said. They gave me 10 minutes. Then they postponed the rehearsal. I drove home in the dark. That night, my wife was already asleep. I went to my study and turned on only the small lamp on the corner of the desk. I sat down. The city outside was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes after midnight, when even the distant traffic has thinned to almost nothing. I opened the Gospel again, not for research. The research was done. I couldn't have explained at the time why I opened it. I just did. I turned to the crucifixion account. I had read it once already during my initial read-through, quickly, with the eye of a scholar looking for theological problem points. This time, I had no agenda. I just read. And I came to the part where Jesus, while being executed, prays for the people responsible. "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they are doing." I sat with those words for a long time. I have spent my professional life in religious texts. I have read accounts of prophets, of holy men, of spiritual teachers, across traditions spanning thousands of years. I have read things that were extraordinary, and things that were moving, and things that I would call genuinely profound. I understand the history of devotional literature. I understand how religious communities shape the portrayal of their founders toward the ideal. I had no framework for this. This was not mercy as performance. This was not virtue being demonstrated for the benefit of a future audience. There was no audience in this moment for whom this would have made strategic sense. This was a man at the absolute limit of human suffering, asking God not to hold it against the people causing the suffering, and giving a reason that was not anger dressed as grace, but something entirely without anger. They don't know. I sat at my desk for a very long time. At some point, I stopped seeing the page clearly. I set the book down on the desk with it still open. The lamp was still on. I put my head on my folded arms. I fell asleep. What happened next, I have told almost no one in this level of detail. I am not someone given to mystical claims. My entire career was built on the premise that claims require evidence, and evidence requires honest examination. I offer this next part, with that stated clearly. I only know what I experienced. I was standing somewhere that was completely dark. Not cold, not frightening, just dark in every direction, completely and evenly, the way darkness is only in your deepest memory of a very old night. Then there was light. Not like lamplight or sunlight. This light had a quality to it that I cannot accurately put into words in any language I speak, and I speak for. It had the quality of presence, of attention directed specifically at where I was standing. And from within that light, someone walked toward me. I knew, before I could have explained how I knew. The first thing I braced for was judgment. I had spent 20 years publicly dismantling the claims this figure's followers made about him. I had done it on television. I had done it in books that were still in print, still being read, still shaping other people's conclusions. If judgment was coming, I had given it material to work with. There was no judgment. What I felt instead was authority of a kind that I had no previous reference point for. Authority that did not demand anything from me, that did not require my acknowledgement or agreement, that simply was, the way gravity simply is. And alongside that authority, something that I can only call compassion, but not the general, distributed kind, specific, directed, as though what stood in front of me was aware not just of the person I presented publicly, but of every version of me that had existed since I was a boy, in the back of my uncle's bookshop, learning to find what was wrong with things. He said, "You searched my words looking for lies, but my words have been searching your heart." My knees gave. I don't know how to describe what happened next, except to say that everything I had built, not just the career, not just the reputation, not just the television contracts and the speaking invitations, but the entire internal structure I had constructed over 25 years, the certainty, the positions, the identity built on being the man who had examined this and arrived at a conclusion, it all released. Not destroyed, released, like something that had been held too tightly for too long and was finally allowed to open. He extended his hands. I saw the scars, and in a way that I still cannot fully put into language, I understood that this moment was not an ending. It was the beginning of something I had not known I was moving toward. I woke up before dawn with my face wet, and the Bible still open on the desk, exactly where I had set it down. The lamp was still on. The city outside was starting to go from black to gray. I sat there for a long time without moving, and for the first time in my adult life, I did not feel the need to defend anything. The broadcast was 8 days away, and I knew what I had to do. I called the network the next morning and told them I would be there. The producer was audibly relieved. He assumed whatever had happened at the rehearsal was behind me now. He was right, just not in the way he meant. The night of the broadcast, I put on the suit I had chosen for the occasion, a dark charcoal one I had bought specifically for this event, and I stood in the bathroom, looking at myself in the mirror for a while. I was not composing an argument. I was not rehearsing sentences. I was just looking at the person looking back at me, and acknowledging, quietly, that he was not the same person who had said yes to this phone call. I drove to the studio. The audience was full, in a way I had never quite seen before. The room had an energy to it that events rarely achieve, the specific electricity of a moment that everyone present has been waiting for. The production staff was moving with purpose. The monitors were live. The cameras were ready. I stood backstage and listened to the host's introduction through the monitor. He described me as one of the foremost religious scholars in the country. He described the event as historic. He said that what was about to happen on this stage had never been attempted before on national television. The audience responded with the kind of applause that means they agree and are glad they are here to see it. I walked to the podium. I looked out at the audience. I looked at the cameras. I looked at the production booth to my right, where the team was watching monitors that were showing my face, in close-up to a nation. I looked down at my notes. I stood there for almost a full minute. I know because I counted, internally, aware of every second passing, aware of the room shifting, aware of producers beginning to exchange looks, aware of the audience starting to lean forward in that way that means something is wrong, and they can feel it. I looked up. I cannot continue with the presentation I prepared. The studio went so completely quiet that the ventilation system was suddenly the loudest thing in the room. I said calmly, without performance, that I had spent the past several weeks reading the text I had planned to argue against. I said that in doing so I had come face to face with questions that I could no longer pretend were settled. I said that for 20 years I had presented certain historical arguments with a confidence that genuine examination of the primary sources did not justify. I said I was not standing there to tell anyone what to believe. I was standing there because I could not do what I had promised to do tonight without being dishonest in a way I was no longer willing to be. I said that I was sorry, not to the network, not to the sponsors, to the students who had walked out of my seminars carrying certainty I had handed them without having actually verified, to everyone who had built something on a foundation that I had assured them was solid and that I now understood I had never properly inspected. I stepped back from the podium. The network cut to commercial 40 seconds later. The studio erupted into something I still cannot fully categorize. Not anger exactly, though there was anger. Not grief, though there was something in the room that felt adjacent to it. Just a large number of people who had expected one thing and received something they had no framework for. I walked off stage. The aftermath was swift and total. Sponsors withdrew within 48 hours. The television network cancelled my program formally by the end of the week. Colleagues who had been calling to congratulate me went silent and then went public. Two scholars I had genuinely respected gave interviews using the word breakdown and the word stunt in close proximity to my name. My phone, which had rung constantly for 15 years, went almost completely silent. I will not tell you that didn't hurt. It hurt considerably. I had not understood until it was gone how much of my sense of who I was had been tied to those calls, to the packed rooms, to the specific feeling of being the person in a conversation that everyone else was oriented toward. Losing it all inside a single week was its own kind of education. But underneath the loss, underneath the professional humiliation, underneath the particular loneliness of watching a reputation collapse in real time with your name still attached to it, there was something I had not felt in longer than I could clearly remember. Peace, not satisfaction, not happiness in any conventional sense, not the triumphant relief of having made the right move in a strategic game, just peace. The specific quiet of a person who has stopped performing and started simply existing. I spent the months that followed in private, reading, studying, not to build the next argument, not to prepare the next lecture, not to produce the next book, just to actually sit with what I believed and what I did not believe and what I genuinely did not know, which turned out to be the most honest I had been in years. My wife sat across from me one evening, watching me read, and said without preamble, "You seem like yourself." I asked what she meant. She thought about it for a moment, like the person I thought I was marrying, before all the cameras decided who you were. Over time, quietly, and without a strategy, a small group began gathering in our home. A handful of people at first, then a dozen. People from different backgrounds, different traditions, some with deep religious commitments, some with none at all, but all with questions they had never felt safe asking out loud in a room that had stakes attached to the answer. We would sit around the table with the gospel open, and other texts too, and we would read and argue, and fall silent, and read again. Nobody was building toward anything. Nobody was performing for anyone. The goal was not to win. The goal was to understand, or at least to be honest, about what we didn't yet understand, which turned out to be the same thing practiced consistently over time. That small group grew slowly, not into a movement, not into a ministry with a logo and a donor list and a broadcast schedule, into a room where people could come with real questions and leave having asked them honestly. My home became known, quietly, as a place where conversations replaced arguments and where nobody had to pretend to certainty they didn't possess. Years have passed now. I am watching a new group gather around a well-worn gospel in my living room as I think about how to close this story. And I am aware of something I could not have predicted the night I stood at that podium and said the words that ended everything I had spent 20 years building. I am grateful. Not because the road after that night was easy. It was not. Not because I have arrived at some complete and settled understanding of everything I once thought I understood. I haven't. But because I know the difference now between standing in the middle of a performance and standing in the middle of something true. And I know which one I am able to live in. The book I once intended to destroy in front of an entire nation, under lights, on camera, with millions watching, turned out to be the one that had been quietly looking for me the whole time. The one that found me in a dim study at 2 in the morning when there were no cameras and no audience and no argument left to make. My uncle Samir handed me a pamphlet across a bookshop counter when I was 11 years old and told me to find out what was wrong with it. It took me more than 3 decades to finally do that, with enough honesty to let the answer be whatever it actually was. I think he would have approved of the method, even if the conclusion surprised him. If this story stayed with you today, the most meaningful thing you can do right now is subscribe. Because what I'm sharing next are the stories I've carried the longest. The ones about what happens when someone is willing to question the thing their entire life is built on. There are 2 videos on the screen right now, and both of them are exactly that kind of story. The kind that remind you what it looks like when a person chooses truth over comfort. I think you'll want to watch both of them. We'll see you in the next one.